But I want to talk a little bit about our process for building what we're calling a statewide resilience or resiliency system. A couple of prefaces based on some of the conversation I've already heard. My presentation is laced with values. We are trying to solve a very real-world problem with record disasters that we've had over and over again. So we're coming from that perspective and trying to shift from a reactive to a proactive stance. So that's my perspective. I've worked in disasters for the last 7 years, volunteered Katrina, Ike, and then worked all of the major Colorado disasters. So certainly my lens starts there, but I'm really interested in learning and growing in terms of what we're trying to accomplish in that sense. The second thing is that our process was a very consensus-based process where we had to educate ourselves at the same time that we were trying to plan for resilience at the end of the day. So there are certainly some shortcomings that the second time around when we address our framework and our programming that it will certainly have a lot of room for improvement. To start out, who are we? So we are actually a very small office within the governor's office. We were created in the days following the 2013 Colorado floods. Many of you are familiar with those. Really the biggest disaster in terms of losses that we've seen in state history. We estimate about $3.9 billion when you look at impacts to housing, to the economy, to infrastructure, and to our watersheds in Colorado. Very similar to some previous disasters that we had, but the idea with our office is that the governor wanted to have an executive level office that was able to coordinate across the different agencies and across the 30 different funding sources, federal, state, nonprofit that we're dealing with. In June of 2014, after we'd gotten through a lot of the exigent or more emergency response and short-term recovery issues and starting to move into intermediate and long-term recovery, we convened a conversation with state, federal, local, nonprofit agencies to talk about what this buzzword of resilience actually means and how it might be applied in the state of Colorado. And that was in the context of the fact that we had, again, record disasters. So for just a minute, I will let you guys take a look at our definition of resilience or resiliency. What we're really looking at is both the concept of being able to bounce back, but especially to positively adapt and thrive amidst changing conditions or challenges. That could be climate change, that could be hazards or disasters. And then we have a value statement at the end of our definition, which is that we want to be able to maintain and enhance our way of life in Colorado and be proactive in addressing a lot of the shocks and stresses that are coming down the road or that we're already susceptible to. And I certainly welcome any feedback in terms of our definition over wine or in here as well and throughout the week. Yes?
You said enhance, but I didn't read enhance.
To adapt to or thrive, and I think that's where we're getting at that. So, and that is actually something where we do have the maintain quality of life, which might lead to a little bit of confusion there, but we're trying to focus on not just dealing with the event and trying to rebuild, try to recover, and maybe mitigate losses, but we're really focused on our communities being able to thrive as conditions are changing. And I'll get into that a little bit more in just a minute and what I mean there. So why prioritize resiliency? History tells us Colorado is not immune to disasters. When I started at State Emergency Management a little while back, I thought it was going to be a great time to plan and do a lot of mitigation, and then from 2012 to 2013 we set record after record after record with most serious disasters in state history. We know that conditions are changing. There's some great reports on how climate change is going to impact Colorado. Some of the conclusions are a little less clear than you might see in other parts of the country, but we know that conditions are changing, and that means a lot of changes in our communities and with our risks. Population is growing. We're expecting Colorado to go from just about 5 million at the 2010 census to about 7.7 million in 2040. The governor just released the state water plan, and we also expect about 153 billion, I'm trying to remember whether it's acre feet or something else, but a very significant shortfall in the amount of water available for the population that we have in a system that doesn't necessarily accommodate that right now. And we do have a lot of unique communities and way of life that we want to be able to preserve and enhance. Just to go through the disaster history, I won't go through each of these, but we've had a lot of disasters, extreme precipitation, wildfire events that have either been triggered by drought or by Forest conditions, we've had multi-billion-dollar events. The Big Thompson flood in '76 resulted in 145 deaths. And then, of course, the 2013 floods resulted in impacts to 24 counties, 18 of which were declared by a disaster, and again, $3.9 billion in damages. So we're coming with our resilience efforts from the perspective that we want to change that cycle of disaster after disaster, then recover, and get to a little bit more proactive stance where we can help our communities not just to avoid damages, but also, again, to thrive as we deal with population growth, as we deal with climate change, other issues like that. So just to talk a little bit about climate change, we know that it is real here. Projections of 2.5 to 6.5 degrees Fahrenheit warming generally by 2050. But another point that I'll make is Colorado's climate is already very variable. We have had extreme events over history. Those will continue. So we need to both plan for the a little bit more unknown of what's going to happen with climate change, but also with the awareness that we're already susceptible to the disasters that we have. So the result, I mentioned that conversation in 2014, the Colorado Resiliency Framework was the result of that. It was a year-long process with about 150 plus stakeholders from federal, state, local agencies. And we were really focused in this framework on developing some guiding principles for local communities to be able to address their own resilience, but also to set a very tangible course for what it is that we as the state of Colorado can do to make our state more resilient in the face of future threats. So you'll see in the framework, I have a couple of copies with me as well as a handout, so you guys are welcome to see that throughout the week. But we have some very specific strategies in there as well that we plan to undertake. This is just to point out a couple of things. One, the level of stakeholder engagement. We had disciplines and agencies that range from human services and housing to public health and environment to the land use folks, economic development, on through to emergency management. And what we did with our framework is plan around 6 sectors that we felt would be most representative of the community. And so we identified economic community, which is focused on land use, smart growth, floodplain management, emergency management, health and social, not just health and social services, but also social vulnerability, social capacity and networking, housing, watersheds and natural resources, which are a huge issue unto themselves in Colorado, and then infrastructure as well. And then, of course, all the little subsectors within infrastructure. And we conducted a fairly significant community engagement process as a piece of this framework as well. But we have tangible strategies within each of those sectors, but also we're trying to identify the interdependencies and the ways that we can actually coordinate actions across those various different disciplines. One of my favorite things to see through the framework process was our Director of Housing and our Director of Transportation actually coming to some consensus when they started very far apart because they just didn't speak the same language. And now we have some examples of where they're actually planning and trying to implement together towards the same end. So with trying to bring in the risk or vulnerability conversation, we view that as a very fundamental piece of our overall resiliency framework. Risk and vulnerability actually help to inform what it is that we actually want to do. And we look at that, I saw that on some of the stickies up there before, but we're looking at vulnerability in terms of both the shocks and the stresses. We know that we have floods, we know that we have wildfires, tornadoes, but we also know that we have a shortage of affordable housing. We know that we have communities that are dependent on a single economic sector, such as tourism. We know that there are any number of underlying stresses that might actually magnify the impact of a disaster, or in some cases there's a wildfire that's 10 miles away, doesn't even impact the community, and their economic sector is hit extremely hard because everybody from out of state thinks there was a disaster there. So with that in mind, I just wanted to give you a couple of examples of really where we're starting. We know that this document is very imperfect, but we know that it's a starting point in terms of what it is that we actually want to do. So with housing, we looked at some of the shocks and some of the stresses and got to some example initial strategies. We don't currently have a full inventory across all communities in Colorado of where housing, and especially housing for vulnerable populations, are located in hazardous zones, whether that's the wildland-urban interface or the floodplain. So one idea was to be able to actually inventory and start to understand that risk. Housing codes toolkit. So what are ways that we can improve safety but also deal with some of those stresses? Energy efficiency is going to help with folks reducing their costs and perhaps being able to have better opportunity in that way. Design requirements. So those were some of the things that came up in housing. Infrastructure. We wanted to have a comprehensive approach to hazards, so not just think myopically about one disaster or one hazard, but a more integrated approach. And then our infrastructure folks are starting to think about actual design standards. And it doesn't necessarily mean building the biggest bridge, but it means building the most appropriate bridge that's going to reduce risk, but also that we can maintain over time. So this, you'll see this in one of the handouts that I have, but this is just our very first set of actual tangible actions that we as the state of Colorado want to take. This is not just about recovering from the floods, but this is again about shifting to a more proactive stance in dealing with both potential future shocks and also potential future stresses. So a big piece of that is educating and engaging, working with anybody from individual residents on through to local governments and state government agencies. Advancing local resiliency strategies, so enabling communities to collaboratively plan across sectors and jurisdictions for resilience. I'll talk a little bit about the public-private partnership fund that we're also wanting to set up a little bit later as well. To that end, we're piloting a local resilience planning process in 3 counties right now. They were 3 of the hardest hit counties by recent disasters, so it was a little bit easier to talk to them about what this topic of resilience is and why that brings value to their communities. But in that, we're trying to evaluate existing conditions or establish a baseline of where they are, look at their shocks and stresses, and then use that to identify strategies across sectors. We're using the state framework as a model for those local plans, although there's a lot of customization. That way we have some consistency and we can again speak the same language across levels of government and across jurisdictions and across sectors. It's not just a government-based process. And certainly each plan and community has a little bit different flavor to it. El Paso County is a little bit more of a conservative community. It's very strongly military, so some of those issues come up in their plan around the shocks and stresses and strategies. Boulder County is a fairly progressive community. They've got a lot of land use, a lot of environmental restoration. The strategies are different, but they are starting to speak the same language. And so those of you interested will be able to look at some of those local plans by January of 2016. Out of that process, we're also trying to figure out how we can fund and enable communities to invest in resilience and what are the various focus areas of investment that we want to think about. This graphic actually comes from our, what I believe to be a stellar proposal that should be fully funded by HUD for the National Disaster Resilience Competition, when in reality we probably will not receive all the funding that we want. But we're really trying to set up a systematic approach to resilience that addresses 3 key components. The first is resilient community building, and this is getting to that qualitative piece. It's not necessarily a very quantitative focused investment area, but really engaging, educating community, building social capital, building relationships, and giving residents, small businesses, and communities tools to be able to address resilience on their own. So there are a number of initiatives that we want to support to that end. The second piece of that, I said risk is very fundamental to our approach, and I'll get into what one of the initiatives we want to do for risk management, but really giving communities the tools to better understand what their risks, whether from natural hazards or climate, are from as well. And then we use the community building and the risk management to then influence capital investments, whether those are disaster risk reduction projects or whether those are capital improvement projects, housing or otherwise. We want to apply that resiliency lens to the way that communities invest, and then we want to be able to support those types of projects with our program. So the risk analysis tool, I'll talk about that just very briefly, but we want to develop a geospatial tool, open source, online, that gives the communities in Colorado the ability to scenario plan with a better understanding of their risks. So what does that mean? This is very conceptual right now, and certainly I'm sure there's some good advice that I can get this week. But we want communities to be able to first evaluate their existing development and their growth patterns, but then look at hazard overlays, land use regulations, natural resources, and climate to look at that into the future and hopefully influence the development decisions that they make. Yep, that would be mine. I'm trying to time myself to hold myself accountable. Yes. I can go through these a little bit later since we're just about out of time, but these are a couple more projects that we've put forward. What I'll say is we're trying to flip traditional risk mitigation projects on their head and think about community connectivity, social systems, economic development in conjunction with disaster risk reduction. The last piece I'll touch on before I wrap up is our Community Resiliency Partnership Fund. We currently have about $1 million, a very, very small amount dedicated to this fund right now. But we're looking to actually, hopefully, attract private sector investment to provide communities with a very affordable tool to be able to invest in resilience. So potential customers could be local governments that want something more affordable than the traditional bonding market, could be affordable housing developers that want to make resiliency enhancements to their affordable housing developments. And one of the things that is exciting is there could be, especially for housing, a Community Reinvestment Act interface. So there's an incentive for the private sector to want to invest. The idea is we want to be able to continue to fund these types of activities, knowing that budget cycles are not always going to be predictable, even though Roger's going to give me a lot of money from NOAA. That's what I expect.
Yeah, and
so,
that's I'll pay you $5 to stop too.
Yes.
But great job though.
Excellent.
Because I want to get, now these are just clarification questions on a couple of things here. Right?
Yes.
Okay.
How are you doing taking new projects where they were going to go and they're going to build something out in the environment, or they're going to do a new public building? How are you trying to get them to consider various kinds of resilience factors so that when it's cheap, because they're already building a new courthouse or whatever,
right,
that they start thinking through how would that facility be used or be valuable or survive and then be part of the recovery process or other things. So that's where it's
right,
usually cheap, is do it when something new is being developed. But
right,
they often ignore resiliency criteria in the standard architectural and design processes.
So a great example that's taken place with our Colorado recovery process that we're hoping to continue was the reconstruction of our roadways and steep canyons along with the restoration of watersheds at the same time. Traditionally speaking, roads were built on fill and designed to overcome the river as opposed to exist in harmony with our river system. So we had our watershed restoration folks and our transportation folks design together, implement together, so we're improving water quality, improving the condition of the river, but also ensuring that the road has a much better chance of withstanding the next flood like it did. So that's just one example. Yeah.
We can take off on some of those. I like the question a great deal, but I want to take off on some of those when we get to the broader question. Roger?
Quick question.
Yeah.
One of your slides refers to the fact that you want to build a culture of resilience.
Yes.
Do you actually mean that?
We do mean that, yes. We do very sincerely mean that, both in state government, but also empower communities to take that on.
What does it mean to you?
What does it mean to us? It means, for one, the way that we approach the community development and the state investment process. It means also trying to engage, again, with vulnerable populations and communities with bottom-up processes that also guide the way that communities in the state invest in both capital improvements, but also in recovery.
Sir.
Yes, Iain, I was curious how the partnership with the private sector is developing.
I will say right now that we're in our initial discussions. Folks have been pretty receptive so far, but really our biggest challenge is going to be getting to the bottom line for the private sector and what's the incentive for them, and so that's what we're working on.
Okay, so Igor, and then Susie, and then we're on to the next.
So what would be the difference between culture of risk awareness with culture of resilience from your point of view?
So I think risk awareness would be very much focused on tangibly trying to reduce risk, but when you start to build in some of the concepts of economic development and social capital that go a little bit beyond just defensible space to your property, then you're starting to get to that culture piece.
So let's get back to some of these during the discussion as well, right? Because that has a lot of weight to it. Susie, last question for this. Again, clarification.
You made a comment when you started that said we're just now, 2 years into it, we will update this, and you sort of alluded to there's something wrong with this, that you would like to be different now if you had started over.
It's not that there's something wrong, it's that we have a lot of room to learn and improve, and we know that already.
And so what are some of the issues that are sort of, would be up for revision?
Well, I think, for instance, there are areas of our framework that were much more tangible than others. So infrastructure, resilience, or risk management is much easier to understand sometimes than dealing with the health and social sector or even the economic sector. So we're trying to better understand how it can be tangible.
Let's draw that out a little bit more during the discussion. And so there's a couple quick things that came up here. Thank you very much, Iain.